There's a quiet weight in the memories kept by those who grew up in the 1930s. When you imagine that era, perhaps you picture sepia-toned photographs, people neatly dressed, no matter the weather, and an unyielding sense of resilience that seemed to stretch across every home and heart. But beneath those images lies a more subtle reality, a tender, often unspoken emotional landscape that shaped an entire generation in ways many of us still carry today. If you have ever felt a gentle restraint within yourself or noticed patterns of endurance, self-reliance, or even quiet sacrifice, this might be a time to sit with those feelings, to understand them not as limitations, but as parts of a deeply human story unfolding across decades. This video is for anyone who has wondered about the invisible threads connecting their present selves with the echoes of the past, especially those whose roots trace back to that period. Perhaps you are someone who grows tired of rushing through life's complexities and wishes to hold space for a slower, more reflective understanding. If that sounds like you, then I invite you to remain here for a while and walk softly through these reflections. And if this resonates, consider pausing to stay connected for more conversations like this, unfolding gently over time. In many ways, a central belief about people who grew up during the 1930s is that strength meant silence. Growing up in an era haunted by hardship, marked by economic turmoil, global uncertainty, and loss, there emerged a sense that emotions were luxuries the world could barely afford. This belief often sounds reasonable. If the world is harsh, then to survive, one must hold feelings close, bury fears deep, and present a brave front no matter what. This makes sense emotionally because when survival was often uncertain and vulnerability could feel perilous, emotional restraint became a protective mechanism. To feel too much or express those feelings could seem like a risk not worth taking. What nobody talks about, though, is how this quiet strength also carried a price, one that was paid in unspoken loneliness and a tendency toward emotional self-sufficiency that sometimes folded into isolation. The subtleties here are important. It is not about weakness or failure, but about a survival style shaped by the conditions of that time. Imagine an old oak tree standing firm amid a storm, its branches strained, but its roots gripping the earth so tightly it will not fall. The oak embodies resilience, but beneath the surface, its roots sometimes grow deep in soil, too compacted for easy nourishment. In this metaphor, the oak's strength is real, but it carries an inner tension, a tension familiar to many who grew up then. Another common belief tied to this generation is that independence meant never asking for help. This idea suggests that asking for support was somehow a sign of personal weakness, or at least unnecessary. This, too, is understandable. When families were spread thin and communities had limited resources, reliance had to be carefully measured. Children learned to solve their own problems quietly, and adults managed burdens without complaint. Now, you might be thinking, how can all this silent suffering not have caused deeper wounds? That is exactly where understanding truly begins. The self-reliance of that generation was not about rejecting connection, but about fulfilling what felt necessary at the moment. Emotional support was often given through actions rather than words, through providing stability or managing practical needs, more than through open conversations about feelings. What nobody talks about in these stories is how the external silence sometimes masked a rich internal dialogue, a constant negotiation with hope, fear, and determination. Psychologically, this generation developed a kind of emotional resilience that was, in some ways, a skill of compartmentalization. The stress of external circumstances taught the brain to prioritize survival by managing how emotions were processed and expressed. This is not to say emotions were absent. Rather, they were woven into everyday life differently, often held privately or expressed through small gestures rather than overt displays. It creates a pattern that some may now recognize as stoicism, but it is far more nuanced, rooted in context and necessity. Consider for a moment the image of a well-built dam holding back a river. The dam is purposeful and strong, designed to protect what lies behind it. But this structure must be carefully maintained. Too much pressure, and cracks may appear. The dam's purpose is safety, but must also release just enough water to prevent damage to itself. This extended metaphor helps us understand the delicate balance within those who grew up in the 1930s. They constructed emotional boundaries to protect themselves and their families. These boundaries were neither walls nor prisons, but carefully crafted safeguards. Still, inside, the currents of feeling continued to flow, sometimes forcefully, sometimes quietly, shaping experiences beneath the surface. One revelation that gently unfolds when considering this generation is how deeply their experiences ripple outward, shaping family dynamics and personal relationships even now. For example, it is not unusual to find patterns of emotional reservation passed from parents to children, not through deliberate teaching, but as an unconscious inheritance. Imagine a grandmother who rarely spoke of hardship, but whose steady presence imparted a silent message that endurance matters more than complaint. Such behavior might easily be misunderstood as emotional distance, but in truth, it often stems from a profound form of care expressed through reliability and sacrifice rather than conversation. To recognize this is to shift from judgment toward empathy. Another significant insight relates to the broader social context in which these individuals lived. This was a time before modern psychological conversations were mainstream, and mental health was often hidden behind a veil of stigma. As a result, many dealt with internal struggles silently, with only limited access to support. The societal norm was to put on a brave face and move forward, no matter the personal cost. This systemic pattern deepens our understanding. The challenges experienced were not personal failures, but reflections of the era's cultural and economic realities. This perspective invites self-compassion for those carrying these invisible legacies. There are also moments when behaviors rooted in comfort can overlap with avoidance, making it harder to distinguish one from the other without judgment. For instance, hesitation to express vulnerability, while protective and understandable, can also limit emotional closeness. Yet, this is not a flaw. It's a nuanced stance shaped by experience and survival tactics that made sense in context. The question then is not what is wrong, but what feelings and needs lie beneath this way of being. This stance opens room for curiosity rather than critique, embracing complexity rather than simplifying it. To bring this into a more grounded reality, picture a simple, realistic story. An elderly man who grew up in the 1930s may gently decline to discuss his feelings about hardship, yet through his daily actions, offering a helping hand to neighbors, keeping his promises, quietly teaching his grandchildren practical skills, he communicates care and presence. He embodies a different kind of emotional language, one that values consistency and action over words. This example helps us see the diversity of expression and the deep, often unseen, emotional labor invested into family and community life. In engaging with these reflections, we might ask ourselves gentle, open-ended questions. How do I recognize resilience and quiet strength within myself or those around me? What feelings emerge when I consider the emotional legacies of those who came before? In what ways can I hold these realities without rushing to fix or change them? These questions encourage slow reflection rather than quick conclusions, inviting us to inhabit complexity with kindness. A reframing that often brings comfort is to understand that emotional reservation and self-reliance, far from being barriers, were adaptations born out of love and necessity. They are not signs of a lack, but of a different form of presence, a testament to how care can be expressed in many diverse ways. This shift in perspective can change how one sees oneself and others, not as lacking or deficient, but as uniquely whole in their historical and emotional context. Returning once more to the metaphor of the dam, we can appreciate its purpose anew. The structure protects and preserves the land behind it, and though it may seem rigid, it is also flexible when it needs to be. Recognizing the tacit balance between safety and flow helps us understand emotional patterns shaped by history. It It reminds us that strength and vulnerability coexist, each essential and neither exclusive. What nobody talks about sufficiently is how these deeply ingrained ways of relating to emotion influence not only individuals, but entire families and communities over time. The legacy of the 1930s generation is reflected in both their remarkable endurance and the quiet emotional currents beneath the surface. To hold this truth gently is to honor them fully, and in doing so, to find more peace in how we carry those threads today. If these reflections have sparked something within you, if you sense the value of slowing down to gently explore emotional histories, you might find comfort in continuing these conversations. There is richness in the slow unfolding of understanding, and you are not alone in walking this path. Thank you for joining in this thoughtful space.